As Latin America was going through what economists refer to it as the lost decade of the 1980s, one country was quietly writing a completely different narrative. While Argentina defaulted on its debt, Brazil fought hyperinflation, and Mexico set off a regional financial crisis, Chile started to create what came to be referred to as an economic miracle. The numbers tell an amazing story. From 1985 to 1996, inflation-adjusted GDP per capita in Chile's grew at an average annual rate of 5%, at a time when most of the rest of Latin America was stagnating. By 2000, Chile had become the dominant economy in the region, topping the charts in all the key measurements, from reduction of poverty to international relevance. This is the story of how a single country has broken free from Latin America's ongoing economic nightmare and built a model that others are still struggling to copy. The foundation of crisis, Latin America's lost decade. In order to understand the miracle of Chile, we must begin by realizing the enormousness of the crisis that consumed Latin America in the 1980s. Countries such as Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico had taken out enormous loans during the 1970s to finance large-scale industrialization projects and infrastructure construction. International creditors were only too willing to lend, awash with petrodollars from oil-rich states looking for safe places to park their cash. Commercial bank debt of Latin America rose at a breathtaking pace from 1975 to 1982, at 20.4% annually. External debt of the region eventually quadrupled from $75 billion in 1975 to about $315 billion in 1983 and reached 50% of the entire region's GDP. So long as the global economy was strong and interest rates were low, this borrowing binge seemed sustainable. Then everything changed. In 1981, the global economy was in recession, and both the United States and Europe were raising interest rates to combat inflation. The crisis was set off by a spark in August 1982. Mexico's then finance minister, Jesus Silva Herzog, informed the Federal Reserve, U.S. Treasury, and International Monetary Fund, IMF, that Mexico was no longer able to service its $80 billion national debt. The crisis quickly spread like wildfire throughout Latin America. The debt service payments rose from $12 billion in 1975 to $66 billion in 1982, and declining commodity prices also decreased export earnings. Nations were caught in the grip of a vicious liquidity squeeze, unable to refinance conditional commitments, let alone raise new money. The upshot was economic ruin, so catastrophic that some called the 1980s La Década Perdida, the lost decade. Chile's alternative route, financial policy, and economic reform. Chile's unique path during those years was very different, but it came from the same desperate sort of place. In 1973, the economy of Chile was in ruins with hyperinflation at nearly 600%, a fiscal deficit of about 25% of GDP, and wiped out international reserves. During the political turmoil of Allende's controversial government, there was enormous uncertainty over property and economic stability. A military coup in September 1973 that installed Augusto Pinochet in power heralded an extreme economic transformation. These were the Chicago Boys, a group of Chilean economists who had trained at the University of Chicago and had studied under economists, including Nobel laureate Milton Friedman. These economists initiated a broad package of market-oriented reforms that would transform the Chilean economy. The first rounds of reform were stunning and painful. Price controls were abolished, public spending was halved, hundreds of state-owned businesses were privatized, and import tariffs were slashed. The shock therapy drove Chile into a deep economic crisis by 1975. With its national output down 15%, its wages 30% below their 1970 level, and unemployment at 20%. Chile remained on the course of market-driven policies, although with adjustments that would prove critical. The government's economic team, made up of people like Hernan Bucci, honed the approach, promoting fiscal restraint but with room for more pragmatic responses to economic shocks. The edifice appears. Chile's economic reality of the 1980s, and after the acid test of Chile's economic model, would come in the 1982 debt crisis that wreaked havoc on Latin America. Although it was hit harder initially than just about any other country, its GDP contracted 14% compared with a Latin America average of 3.2%. Something set Chile apart from its neighbors. Instead of plowing on in austerity forever, Chile's economic authorities played to win. The government temporarily nationalized failing banks, imposed capital controls, and allowed the exchange rate to depreciate. These utilitarian solutions, along with substantial structural reforms, set up Chile for a stunning recovery. After 1985, Chile entered what, in the words of economist Milton Friedman, was the miracle of Chile. For the time period between 1985 to 1996, the average annual growth rate of per capita real income for the country stood at 5%, a rate dramatically higher than that of the rest of Latin America. This long boom was also marked by increased exports, reduced unemployment, and a slow rise in living standards. The economic miracle was in many ways built on a few pillars. There were a couple of reasons for this. First up, Chile had produced a pretty stable macroeconomic environment, with low levels of inflation and a solid fiscal policy. Second, the nation had built a diversified export base beyond traditional copper extraction, to include the agriculture, forestry, fishing, and manufacturing sectors. Third, Chile had developed strong institutions that protected private property rights and securely enforced contracts. Most important, perhaps, Chile had skirted the resource curse that had befallen so many other commodity-rich nations. So yes, the world's largest copper producer has used its natural resource bounty to finance education, infrastructure, and social services, not consumption or graft, democratic transition, and economic consolidation. One of the most surprising things about Chile's economic miracle was that it not only continued, but gained extra strength after the transition to democracy in 1990. When Patricio Aylwin's democratic government came to power on March 11, 1990, many analysts speculated about whether the new order would continue the free market orthodoxy of the Pinochet regime. The response was immediate and unequivocal. The democratic government not only preserved the basic economic structure but expanded it to a certain extent, specifically for social justice and for poverty reduction. This strategy, labeled as growth with equity, envisaged both continued economic liberalization and higher social spending, as well as targeted poverty reduction programs. The results were extraordinary. Chile's average annual economic growth throughout 1990 to 1998 was 7.2%. Followed by 1998 to 2007 with an average rate of 4.4%. Real per capita, GDP expanded 5.6% annually, and real wages grew by 4% annually during the 1990s. Economic breakthrough also made possible a mighty advance of social indicators. The proportion of Chileans living below the poverty line dropped from 38.6% in 1990 to 21.7% in 1998. The rate of extreme poverty dropped even more precipitously, from 12.9% to 5.6% over the same period. Life expectancy rose from 73 years in 1990 to over 75 years by 1997. International recognition and regional leadership. Credit was given to Chile's economic miracle throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. The nation inked free trade deals with top economies such as the United States, the European Union, China, and a number of Latin American nations. These contracts signified Chile's successful insertion into the world economy and its profile as a trustworthy trader. Chile made history in 2010 by being the first South American country to join the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. This narrow club of advanced economies includes countries such as Germany, Japan, and Switzerland. For Chile, the admission reflected the international recognition of its level of development in income, governance, and institutional quality. The contrast with the rest of Latin America began to sharpen. Even as Chile developed strong institutions and policy continuity among several democratic governments, in some regional powers, political instability and economic tumult ran rampant. It is true that Argentina has gone through several other economic crises, among them a catastrophic collapse in 2001. Brazil grappled with chronic inequality and periodic financial volatility. Venezuela blew its oil wealth on corruption and mismanagement, the secrets behind Chile's success. How did Chile's economic miracle happen when so many other Latin American countries foundered? A few important factors set Chile apart from its neighbors. First, Chile was able to maintain very high policy continuity throughout the governments and political cycles. Unlike most other Latin American countries that undergo huge policy swings from one administration to another, Chile achieved a wide consensus that reforms should be market-oriented and that fiscal irresponsibility had to be punished. Second, Chile made significant investment in institutions and human capital. The nation established robust regulatory, judiciary, and civil service systems. This institutional base was the stability investors and businesses needed to plan for the long term. Third, for a commodity-dependent country, Chile guarded its resources relatively better than any other country. Sovereign wealth funds were set up by governments, and they resisted calls for countercyclical fiscal policy. Instead, resource wealth was used for funding productivity-enhancing investments, not for rent-seeking. Fourth, Chile gave full attention to globalization while guaranteeing the sovereignty of politics. Through bilateral trade agreements and foreign investment according to its own rules, with adequate protections, it managed to steer clear of disastrous fixed exchange rate regimes. Fifth, Chile mixed free market reform together with strong social policy. By contrast with other examples on the planet that separate efficiency and equity, in Chile, public agents managed to combine both with targeted policies that served as the counterpoint to economic growth. Challenges and lessons learned. Chile's economic miracle was not without hiccups. The country faced financial woes during the Asian crisis of 1997 to 1998, but it rebounded faster than many other emerging economies. Income inequality stayed stubbornly high despite overall progress, creating social tensions that boiled over into massive protests in 2019. These lessons reflect broader truths about what went wrong with Chile. A growing economy in itself is not enough for sustainable development. Alongside it should come inclusive policies that guarantee development is shared across the board. Contemporary relevance and future prospects. Now, as Latin America grapples with COVID-19, inflation, and geopolitical tensions, the lessons of Chile's experience are highly relevant. The nation's success in keeping macro stability while adjusting to new winds remains a key differentiator against regional comparisons. Conclusion: Chile's economic miracle by Sardastic. Chile's economic miracle is one of the great recent wonders of the world, one of the most extraordinary economic turnarounds of modern economic history. While the rest of Latin America toiled through the lost decade, Chile constructed a model economy that brought steady growth, poverty reduction, and global recognition. Chile's trajectory demonstrates that Latin American countries can grow economically when they pursue the right policies consistently over time. The country made a different choice in the 1980s debt crisis and stuck with it over decades, achieving broadly shared prosperity and international recognition as a development success.